Today's learning objective is students write if-then statements and write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of conditional statements. So first of all, what is a conditional statement? A conditional statement is a logical statement with two parts. A logical statement with two parts. Okay, so the first part is called the hypothesis, and that is the condition that has to be present. And then the second part is the conclusion. So we have two parts. We have a hypothesis and a conclusion. And in general, we are going to be writing them in if-then form. So if-then form basically is if this, then that. So the way that we can show that in notation is with P and then an arrow and Q. And the way you would say that is if P, then Q. So the if part is the hypothesis. And that's the part we're going to represent with the letter P. And the then part is the conclusion, which we'll represent with the letter Q. So if is the hypothesis, then it's the conclusion. Okay, so if it is raining, then there are clouds in the sky. So everything that comes after the word if, before the word then, that is your hypothesis right there. That's P. So the hypothesis is it is raining. Technically, the if and the then are not part of the hypothesis and conclusion. It's just everything after it. All right, so our conclusion is there are clouds in the sky. Okay. Sometimes you will be given a statement and you will have to rewrite it in if-then form. So for example, 1, all birds have feathers. So if it's a bird, then it has to have feathers. That would be kind of if-then, but we'll make it sound a little better than that. If an animal is a bird, then it has feathers. So again, the part after the if, an animal is a bird, that is our hypothesis. It has feathers would be our conclusion. All right, this next one is a little bit tricky. It says two angles are supplementary if they are a linear pair. So the condition that has to be present is that they have to be a linear pair. So this one is one where they've kind of written it backwards. And you can see they already have the word if in there. So if the word if is in there, that's going to be your hypothesis, what follows the if. So to rewrite it in if-then form, we write if two angles are a linear pair, because we want this to make sense. So rather than saying if they are a linear pair, we're starting off a sentence, we need to know what we're talking about. So if two angles are a linear pair, then they are supplementary. And again, this would be our hypothesis, and this would be the conclusion. Now, in addition to the original conditional statement, sometimes we will do things to manipulate the statement. The first thing we're going to talk about is the converse. When we write the converse, we exchange the hypothesis and conclusion. Okay, so one way that you can remember that is if you look at the letters at the start here, CO, and think of that as meaning change order. So we started with if P then Q, so the converse is going to be if Q then P. So in our example here, our if-then statement says, if the measure of angle A equals 99 degrees, then angle A is obtuse. So angle A is obtuse, that's my conclusion. Now I'm going to make that go first. So if angle A is obtuse, then the measure of angle A equals 99. So all we did was we changed the order. We put the hypothesis where the conclusion was, and we put the conclusion where the hypothesis was. So one thing you want to remember is that in order to be true, a statement must be true all of the time, and it only takes one counterexample to prove that the statement is false. So looking at the converse that we just wrote up here, is that converse true for all situations? No, it is not. And it could, just because an angle is obtuse doesn't mean that it has to equal 99 degrees. It could equal anything between 90 and 180 degrees and still be an obtuse angle. So a counterexample, you could just draw some other obtuse angle that has a different measure. And that would be a counterexample for the converse. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is negation. So what negation means is the opposite of the original statement. The opposite of the original statement. So that little tilde sign means negation. Or not. All right, so for example, if I have a statement, the ball is red, okay, statement P, the ball is red, not P would be the opposite. The opposite of the ball being red is the ball is not red. So all I had to do to negate that one was to insert the word not. But sometimes you might have a statement that already has a not in it, so the car is not black. The opposite of that would be the car is black. So we took the not out to make it the opposite. Okay. All right, so you need to know that in order to know how to do the inverse. The inverse is when we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. Negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. Make sure you do both of them. And these are in the same order. Okay, we haven't changed the order for the inverse. So if you look at the start, it says IN. You can think of that as meaning I negate. And that can help you remember what the inverse is. So it's the same order, but everything is negated. So not P, if not P, then not Q. If not P, then not Q. So an example for that one. Okay. So we're going to leave it in the same order. We're just going to negate. So the original if-then statement was if two angles are a linear pair, then they are supplementary. So to negate that, I would say if two angles are not a linear pair. Then they are not supplementary. If two angles are not a linear pair, then they are not supplementary. So would this always be true? Can two angles be supplementary without being a linear pair? They can, so that one is also false. And for a counterexample, again, you could just show angles that are not a linear pair, but are supplementary. Okay, the last one we're going to learn about is contrapositive. With the contrapositive, we change everything. We are going to exchange and negate. Exchange and negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, so we exchange and negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the way that we would write that is if not Q, then not P. If not Q, then not P. All right, so for example, if we're given the if-then statement, if two angles are a linear pair, then they are supplementary. We are going to switch them and negate them. So I'm going to start with the they are supplementary, but of course I don't want to start the sentence if they are, so that because I won't know what they is, so I'm going to say if two angles. So if two angles are not supplementary, because again I have to negate it as well, then they are not a linear pair. Okay, if two angles are not supplementary, then they are not a linear pair. So is that always going to be true? if they are a linear pair, they would have to be supplementary because they add up to 180 degrees. So if they are not supplementary, then they couldn't possibly be a linear pair. That is true. Okay. So one final example here. We are going to write an if-then statement, the converse, the inverse, and contrapositive for the statement, guitar players are musicians. And then we're going to decide whether each one is true or false. So the original if-then statement, if one is a guitar player, then one is a musician. Okay, and then the converse, we change the order, CO. So changing the order, if one is a musician, then one is a guitar player. Okay, I negate, we're staying in the same order, we're just negating. So if one is not a guitar player, then one is not a musician. And then finally the contrapositive, we mix it all up, change the order and negate. So if one is not a musician, then one is not a guitar player. Okay, so let's just go through that again. So our original if-then, if one is a guitar player, then one is a musician. The converse, we change the order. If one is a musician, then one is a guitar player. Inverse, I negate. If one is not a guitar player, then one is not a musician. And the contrapositive, we change the order and we negate it. If one is not a musician, then one is not a guitar player. So let's look at these statements and decide whether they are true or false. So if we look at the first one, if one is a guitar player, then one is a musician. That's true. But is the converse true? If one is a musician, then one is a guitar player. So just because you're a musician, does that mean that you necessarily play the guitar? No, not necessarily. You might play the flute or the clarinet or some other instrument, or maybe you're just a vocalist. So that one is false. If one is not a guitar player, then one is not a musician. Well, it's the same idea. You could be a vocalist and be a musician. You could play the piano and be a musician. You don't have to be a guitar player. So just because you're not a guitar player doesn't mean you're not a musician. So this one is also false. And then finally, if one is not a musician, then one is not a guitar player. That would be true. Because, as we said, if you play guitar, then you are a musician. So if you're not a musician, that means you can't possibly play guitar. If you're not a musician, you don't play any instrument or sing or do anything musical. So that one is true. Okay, this concludes the video. Thank you for watching.